Hi, welcome back to another episode of Nobody's Doing It Right, the podcast for those who are uncertain. My name is Kat, I'm your host, and for today's episode, we're going to be talking about how you can't assume you are able to get something that you want if you aren't acting like the kind of person who would get it. Now, this is going to tie into the law of assumption. And I don't talk about these kinds of topics normally because I like to approach my content from a more grounded, secular perspective. But I also do love incorporating different beliefs and perspectives into my own because that helps me navigate the world in a way that feels aligned and authentic for me. But I like to curate it and cultivate it in a way that makes the most sense for me from a more grounded perspective. And I know that other people are like that too, especially if you listen to my content. You relate to what I'm saying and what I say and the way I say it resonates with you. So this is how I take concepts like the law of assumption, because I love to look into all this stuff. I read up on everything, you know. This is how I take concepts like the law of assumption and make it into something that makes sense for me and how I understand it in order to be able to then navigate the world in a way that helps me get what I want or show up in a way that feels aligned for me. How can you assume that you're going to have something if you aren't acting like the kind of person who would get it? Now, I think with things like the law of assumption, manifestation, all that, there is the impulse to believe that it's just about, thinking and then you get it. Obviously, that can be a very simplistic take, but I'm sure that works for some people. I'm not here to say that this isn't at all how it works or how it could work for you. You do what you need to do, right? Think about it the way you want to think about it. But for me, it feels very simplistic to say you just, you think it and you get it. You believe it and it happens. Like, great, but what does that actually mean? Like, I actually need tangible steps, or I need something tangible to hold on to be able to understand this concept and actually make it work for me. So for me, the assumption part of this is not just the idea of, oh, I'm just going to believe I have it and I'm going to have it. The assumption part is the assumption towards myself as a person. What do I assume of myself? How do I assume I am as a person? This comes down to self-concept and your own self-limiting beliefs. Because if you assume you are somebody who doesn't have these things, doesn't get these things, then of course you're not going to get them because you've assumed this identity for yourself. You've put this identity on yourself. So in order to get the things you want, to have the law of assumption work for you, you have to assume that you are this kind of person. You have to assume that about yourself. You have to assume that you're going to show up this way. You're going to take these steps. When you wake up in the morning, it should be an assumption that you're going to, do what you need to do. You're going to go out for a walk because you are somebody who wants to, have more, to be more physically fit. You have to be able to assume that about yourself. But how can you assume that about yourself if you're not taking the action as well? You cannot separate the mental aspect of this from the physical aspect. You have to take the action in order to prove to yourself that you are somebody who can assume that you're going to do this. It is a habit, it is an act that you've done before, you've seen yourself do it, so now you can assume that you're going to do it again. But there is a level of belief that you have to tie into this, right? A belief even before you start doing the things that you need to do in order to have the inspiration to do those things. The two go hand in hand, they work in tandem, you can't separate them. But this is a technique I've used a lot for myself, right? Where I've had to really change the identity I have for myself, the way I show up in order to assume differently about who I am. For a long time, I assumed I could never make videos where I speak to a camera. I assumed that I was bad at public speaking. That was a belief I held for a really long time until randomly one day I decided to post a TikTok video because I wanted simply to get more eyes on my writing because I assumed I was a better writer. And that TikTok video did really well. It blew up and it proved to me a different belief that I could now assume moving forward, which was that I'm actually very good at public speaking, or I'm at least better than I thought I was. And I'm more articulate than I thought I was. And I actually do have a lot of power in the way I speak and in my voice. So now I assume that I'm good at it. Now I assume the identity of somebody who can make videos where I'm speaking verbally, or vocally rather. In videos, in podcast episodes, so now my assumption is so different than it was 2 years ago before I started making videos. And it's as simple as that in a sense, right? But I love this more tangible approach to it because it really has helped me in so many ways. Even with physical exercise, right? Because I love physical exercise. It helps me a lot with my mental health. It just makes me feel better in general. I've had to assume that I am somebody who's going to, go for a run at least 3 times a week, because that's what I have taken on as my identity as a person. If I didn't assume that about myself, if I didn't assume that I was somebody who even liked to work out, I wouldn't do it. Because why would I? Right? Why would I assume I'm that kind of person if I never do it? And why would I do it if I don't assume that I'm that kind of person? Right? So I think this is like a really interesting way to approach it if you're confused about what it means to, what the law of assumption means, and how it can kind of feel a little bit esoteric, kind of spiritual, kind of woo-woo, even though I think everybody's belief system and the way they see things, if it works for you, it works. Like, that's the point of it. And if it doesn't hurt anybody else intentionally, that's the point of it. Or even unintentionally, right? Like, the aim is to not hurt people. But approaching it however you want to approach it. This is just how I approach it and what works best for me, and how I can use these concepts that have been around for a very long time and reframe it in a way that makes sense for me and the way I like to look at things, right? The way I like to look at the world. You won't believe you're able to get something. You won't be able to assume that you are the kind of person that gets something if you're not acting like that kind of person. And you can't act like that kind of person if you don't assume the identity of being that kind of person. And sometimes it takes just one decision to change the assumption you have about yourself. Just like I said with the whole video thing of, I assumed I was a bad public speaker because throughout most of my childhood in school, I never had positive feedback when it came to public speaking. I also wasn't given the opportunity or the ability to practice it in a way that was authentic for me. You do it in school and they tell you this is what you're going to talk about, you use your cue cards and you do it this way. I wasn't given tools that worked best for me and how I want to do it. Had I been given those tools when I was younger, maybe I would have had a different assumption about myself earlier on, and maybe my life would have been completely different, right? But sometimes it takes just one decision, one moment to completely alter the way you think about yourself, the assumptions you have about yourself. I also think, though, that you can decide today to assume something different about yourself in order to get whatever it is that you want that you might be holding yourself back from right now because you don't feel deep down like you are the kind of person that has that. I think you can do that. I don't think there are limitations in the way we can see ourselves, right? We hold those limitations, and it really, in many cases comes down to just changing that assumption of who you are and what you're good at, what you're not good at, how people will see you. So obviously this is easier said than done. It's not something that you can do overnight and just now I've changed my life because I assume differently. No, I think it's a practice. You have to do it over and over again. You have to figure out a way that works best for you again. But I do think it can be something that really just comes down to you and the way you see yourself. I think a lot of things come down to the way we see ourselves, right? I think we are our own worst enemy sometimes. We can stand in our own way sometimes, right? Of course, there are things in life that we can't control, of course. But even with those things that you can't control, I think you can still change the way you think about yourself, despite whether or not you can control that thing, right? So the things you assume about yourself have a huge impact on how you show up. So how can you assume that you'll get something, whatever it is that you really want to get, whatever it is that you really want to achieve? How can you assume it if you're then not acting in accordance with the kind of person that would be that thing in order to then, reinforce the assumption? It's kind of this like interesting cycle that requires some practice and some constant evidence that you need to build up by doing actions and then changing the belief and then doing actions. And yeah, I think it's just like an interesting way to look at the law of assumption. If you find that interesting, if it's something that you've wanted to think about a little bit more, obviously look into it yourself too if it works. If this is something that maybe still doesn't make sense for you. It just makes sense for me. And obviously if it makes sense for you, great, love that. But it's helped me a lot. And my assumptions about myself are constantly changing now. And I've learned that there's a lot of control I can have over my assumptions, basically. So yeah, I hope this was interesting. I hope it was informative. I hope it offered you a bit of a reframing on this concept. If you want to work with me one-to-one, I offer Zoom calls and I offer email guidance where we can talk about these things, or you can ask any questions and we can dive a little bit deeper into these concepts. I also have a Substack where I write about these things, and you can follow my social media accounts where I post all my other content. But other than that, thank you for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another episode.